You wake up and reach for your phone before your feet even touch the floor. Your screen is already holding pieces of your life for you. Birthdays, photographs, passwords, directions, messages, reminders, and a calendar quietly telling you what happens next. You don't have to remember much anymore. If you forget someone's face, you open your camera roll. If you forget where you parked, your phone can tell you. And if you forget an appointment, a notification will eventually rescue you. Your ancestors had none of that. For most of human existence, there were no notebooks, no calendars, no photographs, no written instructions, and no tiny glowing screen carrying thousands of memories in your pocket. So here's the strange question. How did ancient humans keep their memories when there was almost nothing outside their own minds to store them? The first thing you have to understand is that your ancestors weren't walking around with terrible memories. Their brains were built from the same basic biological machinery that yours uses today. And memory was not some optional skill for them. It was survival. You had to remember where water was. You had to remember which plants could be eaten. You had to remember where dangerous animals were seen. You had to remember how to make a cutting tool, where your group had found shelter, and which path led back home. Forgetting the wrong thing could be fatal. And this is where the obvious answer gets interesting. You might imagine an ancient human simply trying really hard to memorize everything. But human memory doesn't work like a hard drive, and your ancestors probably didn't depend on raw memorization alone. They built memory into the world around them. Think about how you remember your own childhood. You probably don't remember every ordinary Tuesday. Instead, one smell suddenly brings back your grandmother's kitchen. One song takes you back to a particular summer. One street corner makes an entire memory appear almost instantly. Your ancestors could use the same basic trick, except they had an enormous advantage. They lived inside the landscape. A river wasn't just a river. A mountain wasn't just a mountain. A particular tree could mark a route. A cave could mean shelter, and a strange rock formation could become a permanent reference point. Imagine walking across a landscape with no road signs and no Google Maps. You don't need to memorize a list of coordinates if the landscape itself becomes your map. Archaeologists studying indigenous Australian traditions have documented how songs, stories, landmarks, and movement through the landscape can work together to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. These living traditions are not identical to Paleolithic European or African societies, so they cannot simply be projected backward as direct evidence of prehistoric life, but they demonstrate something powerful about human memory. Information becomes easier to remember when it is attached to places, actions, sounds, and stories. Your ancestors didn't need to remember everything as isolated facts. They could remember a journey, walk past the large stone, follow the river, climb toward the ridge, turn when you reach the unusual tree. The landscape itself becomes a chain of reminders, and that changes what memory really means. Here's what nobody tells you. Human memory becomes much more powerful when you stop treating it like a list and start treating it like a story. Your ancestors were probably surrounded by stories, not stories written in books, stories spoken aloud, repeated around fires, performed through gestures, attached to places and retold whenever knowledge needed to move from one generation to another. Imagine a child sitting beside an older member of the group. The child doesn't receive a textbook explaining which plants are dangerous. Instead, they hear a story about what happened when somebody ate the wrong plant. They learn where it grows. They learn what it looks like. They learn what happens afterward. The information now has emotion attached to it, and the emotional information is easier to remember. You already do this without realizing it. You may forget a random number after 10 minutes, but remember a ridiculous story someone told you 10 years ago. Your brain isn't simply recording everything equally. It constantly decides what deserves attention. Your ancestors could exploit that. A survival lesson became a story. A dangerous location became a warning. A family history became a repeated tale. A hunting technique became something demonstrated rather than merely explained. And repetition did the rest. Long before writing, human beings could transmit information through speech, imitation, rhythm, and performance. We cannot recover exactly what Paleolithic people said because spoken words usually disappear without leaving archaeological traces, but the archaeological record shows that symbolic traditions were already present remarkably early. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found deliberately engraved ochre pieces from roughly 100,000 to 72,000 years ago. Some of the patterns were repeated over long periods, suggesting that particular ways of making marks could persist as cultural traditions rather than appearing as one-off accidents. That doesn't mean the people at Blombos were writing sentences. They almost certainly weren't. But it does show something crucial. Your ancestors were already living in a world filled with learned symbols and repeated patterns tens of thousands of years before modern writing systems appeared. And once humans learned that information could survive outside the brain, everything changed. But there was another memory tool hiding in plain sight: your body. If you have ever learned a song, you know that rhythm can make information strangely difficult to forget. A melody gets stuck in your head even when you desperately want it gone. That annoying little song is actually demonstrating something useful. Rhythm creates structure. Instead of remembering 10 unrelated pieces of information, you remember a familiar pattern. This may help explain why oral cultures around the world have often used repetition, rhythm, performance, poetry, song, and storytelling to transmit knowledge. Modern Indigenous Australian songline traditions, for example, connect knowledge with songs and landscape, creating a powerful system of cultural memory. Again, these are living traditions, not recordings of Stone Age behavior, but they show how sophisticated memory systems can exist without writing. And that matters because your ancestors needed to remember things that could not simply be pointed at. You could point at a river. You couldn't point at yesterday. You couldn't point at your grandfather's story. You couldn't point at the technique for making a particular tool. Those things had to live inside human minds. So humans turned memory into performance. You tell the story. Someone repeats it. Their children hear it. Those children eventually teach their children. Memory becomes social. And here's the part nobody talks about. Your ancestors didn't have to remember everything themselves. They could distribute memory across an entire community. One person might know where particular plants grew. Another might know the best hunting routes. Another might remember the history of the group. Older people could carry knowledge accumulated over decades that younger people had never experienced themselves. That meant an elderly person was not simply old, they could be a living library. That idea changes how you see prehistoric survival. A group that had survived for generations didn't need every individual to know every piece of information. What mattered was that important knowledge remained somewhere inside the social network. If you forgot which berries were dangerous, someone else might know. If you forgot the safest route through a valley, someone older might remember. If a particular animal had not appeared for 20 years, an experienced person could still know what signs to watch for. Memory wasn't only inside your skull, it was between people. And that may have been one of humanity's greatest advantages. Because a single human brain can forget, a group can remember. You can see another version of this idea in archaeology when humans began leaving increasingly durable marks and objects behind. At Blombos Cave, researchers found a small silicrete fragment with a cross-hatched ochre drawing dating to approximately 73,000 to 72,000 years ago. Microscopic and chemical analysis showed that the red ochre had been deliberately applied with an ochre crayon. The researchers cannot tell us exactly what the pattern meant, but the object proves that early Homo sapiens were deliberately creating graphic marks far earlier than previously known examples of abstract drawing. Think about that for a second. 73,000 years ago, someone made those lines. We don't know exactly what they meant, but someone decided that making a mark on an object mattered enough to do. And that is an extraordinary shift, because now part of human thought could survive after the thinker walked away. A person could die. The mark could remain. A generation could disappear. The object could remain. We should be careful here. Archaeologists cannot simply look at an ancient line and declare this was a reminder for them. The exact purpose of many prehistoric marks remain unknown, and some interpretations are debated. But the broader pattern is undeniable. Humans were increasingly making objects that carried information, identity, tradition, or meaning beyond the immediate moment. At Blombos Cave, researchers found engraved ochre across layers spanning over 30,000 years. Researchers studying these patterns have argued that their repeated forms could have functioned as culturally transmitted traditions and potentially as tools for the mind, although their exact meanings remain uncertain. That's an incredibly important distinction. We don't know exactly what they remembered. We can see that they had ways of making certain things persist, and persistence is the heart of memory. Then came something even more powerful: pictures. Thousands of years later, humans were leaving enormous visual records on cave walls. At Lascaux in southwestern France, the famous paintings date back to roughly 23,000 years ago, with archaeological evidence placing the main occupation around 21,500 to 21,000 before present. The walls contain images of animals and other marks created by prehistoric people. Imagine standing inside that cave.